Our God is still on his throne and ruling the affairs of man. Even as he does not change, his truths have not changed. Thankfully, God still has a people which proclaim that old-time religion, setting forth his sovereignty, and the old paths of truth where we can find rest for our souls. Welcome to Word of Sovereign Grace, a ministry of Paradise Primitive Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. Get your Bible, call your friends, and sit back as we open the King James Scriptures to explore the glorious Word of Sovereign Grace. Here's this week's message.
It's always a kind of privilege to be in the house of the Lord. Thankful for the opportunity to come to the house of God and enjoy the fellowship with the Lord and the saints of God. I ask that you stand for me for what time I stand before you this morning. I have a mind to continue on in the book of Daniel as we've been going for the past 7 weeks. As you know, this is new territory for me to try to go through an entire book, doing one chapter in an hour. This is not intended to be an exhaustive study. Hopefully it's stirring up your pure mind and causing you to put your nose in the book. I suspect that some of you that were not reading before are reading now. And I'm encouraged by that. And I suspect that the Lord's pleased when we do so, when we turn to His book and look at His Word. I remind you that we're in the portion, now we're no longer looking at the underlying Aramaic language. We're now in chapter 8 it switches back to Hebrew. And this is it's just interesting to know that what the underlying language is when you begin to look at some of these word usages and some of their definitions and meanings. But it's just good to know that that Daniel 2:4 all the way to 7:29, or the end of the chapter 7, is in Aramaic. Now we're in Hebrew. I'll remind you again that we're looking at these particular lessons and that they are written in sign language. Remember when I gave you that illustration out of the book of Revelation a couple of weeks ago, how that he sent and signified to his servant John? Well, this is also written in sign language. But the most interesting thing about this is that most of this is history, and it makes it somewhat easier. The problems begin when people want to project these particular texts into the future. It really becomes difficult. As you've heard me say on more than one occasion, that it's important to consider the time context of anything that we read in the Word of God, to know, just like the basic things that we consider when we think about context is who, what, when, where, why, and how. Sometimes we can get 2 or 3 of those, maybe more, but I think that time context, especially when it comes to things that were prophetical or prophecy, when Daniel spoke these things, they were still yet in the future from his time, but from our perspective, we're looking back at them. So all prophecy is prophecy. It was future at one time, but not all prophecy is still future. So we just need to keep that in mind. So remember, this is sign language, and I asked you last week to search for the key. Did you find the key that explained what the he-goat and the ram were about? And he tells you that they're the kings of Medo-Persia and Grecia. So that we remember about the Medo-Persian Empire, that there in Daniel chapter 5, when they had the handwriting on the wall that the kingdom would be divided to the Medos and the Persians. Remember, they were amalgamated together. They had the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. So 2 countries joined together because of some marriages that took place. So that's the Medo-Grecian Empire, and then you have, or the Medo-Persian Empire, and then you have Greece. Now that's pretty simple. The Lord tells us what it is. So it's kind of hard to take it and throw it off into the future. Anyhow, I want to let's read through here verse by verse and continue to pray for me and see if we can see some things about and look at a few of the details of some of these individuals that are brought out here. In the 3rd year of the reign of the king of Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. Remember, in chapter 7, it was the 1st year of Belshazzar. This is the 3rd year of Belshazzar. And we remember in Daniel chapter 5, his life ended in that chapter, and that's the reason that these books are not in chronological order. So here's the second vision, and now he has a vision and he's transported. And he says in verse 2, I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. Now, Shushan the palace, that should ring some bells if you've done any kind of reading in the Old Testament. You're going to read about that in the book of Esther, Shushan the palace, and you're going to probably read about it in the book of, I think it's Nehemiah or Ezra. I can't really remember which book, but you're going to read about it in more than one place. So this is a province that's in Persia. So Daniel sees himself in the palace in Persia. He doesn't really know for how many years far off just yet, but that's where Shushan is. And if we're permitted to talk about it later on in some of the kings of the Persian Empire, we'll talk more about that. Then he says in verse 3, Then I lifted up my eyes and behold, and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. Now you remember last week when we saw the vision of the bear lifted up itself on one side. Well, if you lift up on one side, that means you have 2 sides. So that was also talking about the Medo-Persian Empire and how that Persia rose up to become dominant over Media or the Medians, and that's saying the same thing here. And remember, when we think about horns, you think about the horns of an animal. The horn symbolizes the power of the animal. I guess I should have probably just defined that a little earlier on for some of you thinking, what's he talking about when he says a horn? Well, that was very common for the horn to be symbolic of the power of the animal. So these are actually talking about powers. So one horn arose higher than the other, and it came up last. And indeed, history will bear out that Persia did come up last. He says, I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. And he did according to his will and became great. Now you can study some of the history of the Persian Empire, and you can see these conquests that these armies made. And I'll just go ahead and mention here that when we get into chapter 9, we're going to be looking at when we think about the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, we're going to be looking at 3 different decrees that are looked at to determine the timing of the 400 and the 70 weeks of Daniel. And you've got some kings that are in consideration here, and see if I can remember who they are. They're going to be Cyrus. We've already talked about Cyrus was God's anointed. Very strange to call a Gentile, a non-Jew, anointed, but that's exactly what the Scripture calls him. You had Cyrus, then you had Cambyses was a king. Then after him you had Pseudo-Smyrtus, and I'll explain that in just a minute. And after Smyrtus, you had Darius the Great. Then you had Xerxes. Then you had Artaxerxes. And a lot of these you're going to read about. They're in the Old Testament, and you can read about them. So when we start looking at the timing of the different decrees to try to determine when the 470 weeks began, we'll talk more about them. But that Cambyses, if I'm pronouncing that name right, he had a brother that was in line to take the throne. But anyway, while he was down in Egypt, he murdered his brother. Smyrtus was his brother's name, and he murdered his brother. And and he hid the fact that he had murdered his brother. And a couple years later, he was down in Egypt, and an impostor arose and tried to assume the kingdom, and that's why they call him Pseudo-Smyrtus. And I can't remember the guy's name. It starts with a G, and it's really hard to pronounce, at least for me. So that's why when I say Pseudo-Smyrtus, that's who I'm talking about. Anyway, those are some of the Persian kings. But there was a lot of, remember in those days and times, it was pretty much, you lived in a walled city and you were always watching for somebody who was going to come attack you. Thank God we don't live in a day and a time like that, for these people were always fighting, kingdoms always being overthrown. But here it's talking about the Persian Empire became great and pretty much did what they wanted for their period of time. In verse 5 he says, and I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Now, first of all, it says it came from the west. You're going to find out that this is talking about Alexander the Great. And when it says it came from the west, Alexander was from a place called Macedon, or today it's called Macedonia. The borders are a little bit different, of course, as times go by. But his father was Philip, the king of Macedon, and he grew up, as I told you last week, under the tutorage of Aristotle and some other great minds of that day. So Alexander the Great was also very educated. That's one of the things that we can glean from that. But he says, he is the he-goat that came from the west upon the face of the whole earth. Now, when it says the face of the whole earth, it doesn't necessarily mean all 7 continents. It's talking about all the known world. And he did conquer all the known world at that time, just like you find that the Romans did. When it says that the preaching of the gospel went into all the world, well, it did. And the Colossians 1:23 confirms that very fact. But it wasn't all the world without exception. It was all the known world, all the populated world. Anyway, so he had this goat came. He says, and he touched not the ground. This is talking about the speed with which Alexander conquered. He went all the way almost to China, or bordering China, all the way through India. And if you look at the Mediterranean Sea and you look at some of these maps, it was a very large area that he actually conquered. And he says, and this goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Well, that notable horn is Alexander himself. He was very notable. He's probably one of the greatest military minds that's ever walked the face of the planet. So you find that with about 35, he had, I think, 5,000 cavalrymen and about 30,000 infantrymen. That he conquered the world in less than about 10 years. He conquered all these kingdoms everywhere that he went. And there's an idea, a very strong idea, that he had the prince of Grecia was supporting and helping him. Now, that would be an angel. And we read about that a little bit more over in the 10th chapter, I believe. You're going to read about the prince of Persia and the prince of Grecia. And this is Gabriel that's actually doing the talking. And that's another thing that we find in this particular chapter here, is that Gabriel is introduced for the first time. Okay, so like I said, there's a lot more to this, and I don't mean to try to drag everything I can out of every particular verse. You can do your own study. So in verse 6, and he says, and he came to the ram. So there's a he-goat and a ram, and he says in verse 6, and he came to the ram that had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were, remember, Medo-Persian Empire, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. Some say that this was possibly the battle of Alexander crossed the Hellespont, and he went to the Granicus River. So there are 3 major battles that we read about in history. There was one at the Granicus River where Darius was put to flight. Now here, you've got to understand, when we talk about the time of the Persians and the Greeks fighting, this is Darius the Third. Don't confuse him with Darius the Great or Darius. Don't confuse him. There's many that it's like a title like Caesar, okay, or like Herod. There's more than one. I know this gets kind of confusing, but you have to keep that in mind. It's borne out in history. You'll find out this Darius the Third was put to flight after Alexander crossed the Granicus River in that famous battle. Then you had the battle at Gaugamela, and you had the battle at Issus, and where Darius was actually, he was murdered. He was caught. He wasn't able to flee this time, and his family was taken and all that. Another thing that's notable about Alexander is that he took the city of Tyre. Now, if you know anything about Tyre, it's an island city, and it's a half mile offshore. Well, it's pretty good if you want to defend yourself. If somebody's on shore, they're going to have a hard time getting at you. But Alexander was so insistent upon taking the city, they built the causeway, and it took them quite a long time. I think a couple of years, if I remember properly. They built the causeway a half mile on the sea to take the city. So those are some of the things that he's notable for. But anyhow, he says, and he came to the ram that had two horns, which I seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him. What that means, that's bitter indignation. That's what that word choler means. If you know anything about the relationship between these nations, they did not like each other. Okay? So that's what it means here when he moved with choler. It's bitter indignation. And he says, and he smote the ram, and he brake his two horns. So here you have a picture of Alexander defeating the Medo-Persian Empire. And he says, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. This is just basically saying that Alexander whooped him pretty good. And that's what we have there. And in verse 8 he says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Okay, now, this is true. He did wax very great, and actually it said of Alexander, he was about the age of 30 or so, that he was found on his bed weeping. He said, because there are no more worlds to conquer. So he actually, it's quite an amazing story. If you look at actually his history, there's never been anybody like him before as a military general. So, but he became very strong, and then just as a lot quicker than he came up, he went down. He says, and the great horn was broken. He died at the age of 32 years and 8 months old. And as you've heard me mention before, Alexander was a great general, but he was a terrible administrator. So when he wasn't out fighting battles, he was getting himself into trouble. Sort of like King David did, you know, when King David should have been out fighting the battle, he saw Bathsheba there, and you know how that story goes. So he got himself into trouble. And he says, and it came up, and for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. Now, the four notable ones are going to be those four generals that you've heard me talk about. Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And you're going to find out that two of these, later on in the following chapters of Daniel, one's going to be the king of the north, one's going to be the king of the south. So but the kingdom of Greece, for about 15 years after Alexander's death, there was a power struggle going on, and it turned out that it was broken up into four pieces. And that's what it means, the four notable ones toward the four winds. Now, don't let the four winds of heaven make you think that it's talking about something in heaven. It just means north, south, east, and west. That's what it means. It's not complicated. And you'll see that phraseology used in some other places, and we can confirm that. So you had these four kingdoms that came up after Alexander had died, after they struggled for 15 years. And by the way, he died in about 322 BC, I believe it was. Okay? In verse 9 it says, and out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. Now, I tell you straight up, I believe that this is talking about Antiochus IV. I was looking at Josephus, and Josephus bears this out. Josephus is in agreement with it. Of course, I don't answer to Josephus. None of us do. But a lot of historians believe that this is Antiochus that came out of, that began to rule in the area of Assyria. That's right there by Palestine and Israel and all that. And he was the word Epiphanes means illustrious one. And there's another word that's called Epiphanes It's a little twist on it, but it means madman. And that's what a lot of the Jews would call him, Epiphanes. Not Epiphanes, but Epiphanes or something. May not have that exactly right, but they called him a madman. And he began a campaign in about the year 171. And what we have coming out of that particular story is the period of the Maccabees. Okay, so this little horn, I think he's the 8th king in the to rise under the Seleucid kingdom that came out of those four notable horns. You have the Seleucid kingdom. I think he's about the 8th, and there's Epiphanes or Antiochus 1, 2, 3, and he's number 4. And there's some other names that they use for these kings. But you find that he had moved against Jerusalem. And here's the deal that you've got at this time. In Jerusalem, you have the priests that are having these political infightings, and they're fighting over who's going to be the high priest. And what happens is, because Antiochus is pretty much in charge of the region, they're bribing him. They're giving him money. Well, what happened, one of the reasons that actually brought Antiochus on the scene to begin to start his trouble with the Jews is that he was defending someone that had paid him a bigger bribe to become the high priest there in Jerusalem. And as you can imagine, God was not pleased with that. And so God gave them over to Antiochus, and we find out for a period of almost 7 years, till the year December 25th, 165 BC, is when the temple was finally cleansed. And you find out that there were a lot of things that took place. He forbid them to observe the Sabbath. He would not allow them to circumcise their children. He actually set up a statue of Jupiter or Zeus, depending on which culture you view it from, in the temple. They sacrificed swine in the temple. This is all history. You can find this in the book of Maccabees. In chapters 1 and 2, it gives a very detailed explanation of all this that took place. Even though the book of Maccabees is not scripture, it's not inspired, but it is good. I believe that it's good history. I'm trying to keep from going off, and there's so much that you can talk about here. But at December 25th, in the year 165, the cleansing was cleansed and dedicated again because of the efforts of Judah Maccabee, who was one that led the revolt against Antiochus. And they finally were able to sacrifice. They defeated Antiochus. They pushed him back, and they were able to reinstitute the sacrifices again. And actually, in John chapter 10, you find over there that Jesus actually attended the Feast of Dedication. Now, in December 25th, it goes by a couple different names. It's called Hanukkah, and it's also called the Festival of Lights. But it's the time when the temple was rededicated after it had been cleansed from all those things that Antiochus had done there. I'm not making this up, folks. This is, you might think, well, it sounds kind of far-fetched. There's a December 25th. That's the reason that the Jews, or around the time that a lot of Protestants celebrate Christ Mass, that you see a lot of the Jews are doing their Festival of Lights. That's why, because that's the date that the temple was rededicated. Okay. So he was a little horn, and it says in verse 10, and he waxed great even to the host of heaven, and cast it down, some of the hosts and the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. This is just basically saying the kings and the leadership and the people themselves were under his control. And there was a great slaughter that took place by Antiochus. Don't have time to get into all the details of that, but it was a pretty bad situation. But you see how things had degraded among the priesthood, and that God pretty much judged them. That's one of the things that we're seeing. In verse 11, yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. So now here's the difference. We read about the sacrifice being taken away, I believe, in Daniel chapter 9. The difference is, here it actually stopped taking place. And we find in the time of Jesus, after Jesus was crucified, God no longer regarded any sacrifices that the Jews made. That's the difference. Over here, they actually were forcefully made to stop observing the laws of the Jews. And this was a massive campaign to Hellenize all the people. In other words, try to make them, let's make them Greeks. Let's give them the Greek culture. And one of the things that you see actually when God had allowed Alexander to rise to such a degree that he did, it set the stage for the Greek language. And the Greek language, we know, is what the New Testament is written in. So there's a lot of things that are going on here, and there are some reasons why God let all this happen, but we see that because of Alexander became so great and the Greek culture, or the word was Hellenized, or given the Greek culture, that we have the New Testament in Greek. But he was trying to Hellenize the Jews and against the will of the Jews, and it was a big mess. I'll just put it like that. In verse 12, and he says, and a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and proffered. By the way, one of the things you have here is an abomination of desolation. Sometime maybe we need to go discuss the difference between the abomination that maketh desolate and the abomination of the desolation. So there are some things that you're going to see here a little later on in this chapter, if I have time to get to it, I hope I do. It's because of transgression that God let all these things happen. Now I'm kind of giving my interpretation of these things before Daniel actually asked Gabriel, what does it mean? So in order to save a little time. Verse 13, then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, and the transgression of desolation, to give both unto the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So we know that the sanctuary was cleansed when? December 25th, 165 BC. And actually, if you back, this 2,300 days is about 6.6 years. And if you back up, you see that's right about the time Antiochus started harassing the Jews. It's well noted that this is probably one of the first instances of religious persecution to ever take place in the world. Okay, they were persecuted simply because of what they believed. It could have happened in the book of Esther if Mordecai had not moved to do what he did, because there was an edict sent out, because Haman had sent out an edict that all the Jews were going to be killed on a certain day, and that's where you, when that was overruled or overthrown, that's where the festival of Purim comes from. And those are the festival of lights, or Hanukkah, and Purim are two feasts that are celebrated by the Jews that aren't actually directly commanded in the Scriptures. So about 2,300 days. You back up from December 25th, 165, back up 2,300 days. That takes you about to 171, and history will corroborate. That's the time that Antiochus IV started harassing the Jews and persecuting the Jews. Okay, now it says Gabriel. I've got a little note here. It says Gabriel explains his vision, beginning in verse 15. And it came to pass, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as an appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So here's Gabriel the angel. By the way, this is the same Gabriel that came to Mary and told her that she would God would conceive in her womb. And it kind of makes you wonder if Gabriel may have been Daniel's guardian angel. I don't know. When people come and go and pass off the scenes, that would be something else that'd be worthy of study one of these times, to look at guardian angels. But anyway, here's Gabriel. He's sent to Daniel to make him know the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. And he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall the vision be. Now here's where a lot of people just stumble on this. when it says the time of the end, what most people automatically think, the end of time. Well, we've already had the discussion. This is basically, when it says the time of the end, it's the time of the Persian Empire to come to an end. I mean, how do we have to really struggle with that? No, it means the Persian Empire has come to an end, or at least a dominating rule. We know that I told you last week that the Iran was still named Persia up to 1935. Well, their dominating rule came to an end. So if you want to, every time you see the time of the end, you want to project that to the end of time, you're going to have a lot of difficulty understanding a lot of the scripture. And you lift it out of its context, it becomes a pretext. He says, now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. Now this is one of the things you see about a lot of times when angels visit in the scripture. When an angel visits somebody, those people are scared. Okay? I don't know any other way to put that. They're scared. And as we probably rightly should be if we had an angelic vision. But remember this, if anybody does have an angelic vision, that angel's not going to tell you anything that does not line up with this word right here. He said, though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel, let that man be accursed. Joseph Smith never read that, did he? It says, but now as he was speaking, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. And he said, behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. That kind of helps you, give you some idea of the time context. He says, for at the time appointed shall the end be. Is that the end of time? Not necessarily. Okay, just remember the context. What is the context? Well, he's going to tell us what the context is right here. In verse 20, he says, the ram which thou sawest having two horns, or the future Antichrist. No, the kings of Media and Persia. What? And he says, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So how do we, it tells us. It's so plain and so simple. But a lot of people, well, Antiochus is the future Antichrist, a picture of the future Antichrist. Well, like I told you last week in the book of John, John says the Antichrist is already here. And some people are still waiting for the Antichrist. Well, the spirit of Antichrist it's been and probably will be till the end of time. They're waiting on a particular man to sit in the temple of God. I'm getting ahead of myself. In Daniel chapter 9, we'll discuss some of those things about the temple of God and the 70th week of Daniel. I'm very intrigued by the study of the 70th week of Daniel. And as a matter of fact, I'll give you a clue that in Daniel chapter 9, we're gonna get the precise year that the Lord would show up. The precise year. I've never seen this before until last week. I believed it, but I never knew why I believed it until last week. Now I know why I believe it. But you're going to see the precise year, the prophecy of Daniel's 70 weeks, that the Lord would come at a precise time. And I'm going to show you, if the Lord willing, I'm going to show you how that we arrive at that conclusion. But anyway, Daniel's being shown that this ram and the he-goat are the kings of Media and Persia and the kings of Greece. So don't make more of that than it is. Now that's not really hard, is it? Now he says that that being broken. Okay, verse 21. And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken. Okay, now the king, he's broken. He says, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation. Now we're just rehashing or going back over what I've already told you. That those 4 notable horns are 4 kingdoms that would arise, but not in his power. And what that means is they're not going to be as powerful as Alexander was. That's all that's saying. Not in his power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, there's a clue about what time context is. In the latter time of when? Of their kingdom. That's not the end of time, but in the latter time of their kingdom, what kingdom? Medo-Persian Greece. And the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to a full. So here it is. The transgressors coming to a full. This is a clue. You remember, you read about how that God judges when the cup gets full, right? You remember what the Lord said in Matthew chapter 23? Those people said, if we would have been in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have slain the prophets. And Jesus said, so you're saying you're the children of the prophets. He said, fill ye up the measure of your fathers. In other words, when the cup gets full, and God judges it. He said, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressions are come to a full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding of dark sentences shall stand up. And this is talking about Antiochus. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Who do you think maybe the devil's behind this guy? You look in the Old Testament, and you're going to see that happens quite a bit. You find, who was it? It was was it Tyre? The devil's personified in two different kings in the Old Testament. I'm trying to remember. I can't remember, but God only has one. The devil always has many. He has many ways. God has one way. Okay? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The devil has many ways in order to confuse. But this man received I believe he's in league with the devil. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully or completely, and prosper in practice and destroy the mighty and the holy people. So here he's talking about the persecution of the Jews, the slaughter of the Jews. God gave them over because of transgressions. When the transgressors are come to the full. And you can see when people are starting, could you imagine if you had a couple elders in here and they're trying to bribe the congregation, here, I'll give you some money if y'all vote for me to be pastor kind of thing. That would not be good. I don't think the Lord would be pleased with that kind of stuff. But that's what you had those men fighting over the office of high priest. Politics and money entering in. Remember he said the love of money is the root of all evil. I believe it. So they destroyed the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart. And peace shall destroy. That's what any man that's left to himself, that's what he does. When God withdraws his grace from a man, they become lifted up, and they magnify themselves. And by peace he shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes when he shall be broken without hand. In other words, he probably got brave enough to want to, fight the devil himself. He said, and the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. I believe that this book was written about 520. Got a lot of dates in my head. I'm trying to keep them straight. About 520 BC. And then we find that this is talking about 165 to 171 BC. So this was many days in the future. And Daniel said, I fainted and was sick certain days. He said, afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Can you imagine if you had a vision like that? Imagine, too, that an angel came and gave you the understanding of it. And all this stuff being future, it had to be quite an experience. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of chapter 8. I think that one of the things you're going to see that some of the fog clears when we get to chapter 9, and you're going to see one of the most beautiful prayers I think that's ever been prayed. And then you're going to see we're going to talk about the 70 weeks of Daniel. And I've already told you that there's we'll spend probably more time talking about the 70 weeks of Daniel and some of these things that are attributed to the Antichrist. A lot of people today take these things in Daniel chapter 9 and say, it's the Antichrist that's going to sit in the temple. It's the Antichrist that's going to cause the oblation and sacrifice to cease. Well, they don't have a clue because the Lord himself put an end to sin and caused reconciliation of the people of God, not the Antichrist. Besides, I don't want to get too much into this, but besides, there's a major problem trying to build a temple in Jerusalem today, because you have a holy shrine of Islam right there where the temple needs to go. And things would really, really have to shift politically in this environment that we're in today for that to take place. Say the Jews are already They have a prefabricated temple ready to put up there, and they have the ashes of the red heifer, which are necessary for the cleansing, and all this stuff. They say they're ready to go, but I don't think God is going to permit it, because Jesus Christ himself was the once-for-all sacrifice for God's people. And I don't believe there was a reason that the Lord destroyed the temple in 70 A.D. It's because he was done with sacrifices. He was done with those animal sacrifices. Even though they were a picture to point to the Lord Jesus Christ, they're no longer necessary. So, read chapter 9 and look for that key that I told you about, that there is a precise time that we can know what year the Lord came. And not only that, I'm going to tell you on what day he came. Here's one where we know the day and the hour. He started his ministry on the Day of Atonement. Now, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, and we can prove that also very, very readily. Also, you can, as something else to consider, when you think about the timing of all this and the Lord arriving, look at Luke chapter 3, I think it is, in the 15th year of the King Tiberius, or Caesar Tiberius. That's when John the Baptist began to preach and the Lord entered into his ministry. So all those dates, they're there. They're not there to fill in or as filler material. They're there because they're material and they're good. They're good for us to know and understand. So in the 15th year of Tiberius is when John the Baptist began to preach. So if you do your homework and you can pinpoint the year that he came and what day that he actually came. That's not the key. The Tiberius thing is not the key about the precise year. There's another way that we can do it. We'll find it in chapter 9. I thank you all for your good attention. As we stand and sing a suitable hymn, if there's one or more here has the desire...
Word of Sovereign Grace, a ministry of Paradise Primitive Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. Paradise Primitive Baptist Church is located at 5300 Mansfield Road in Arlington, Texas. Services begin at 10:30 each Sunday morning. Plan to come and worship with us. To find out more about Paradise Primitive Baptist Church, visit www.paradisepbc.org. Be sure to visit our website for articles, video, and audio sermons, as well as biblical answers to your questions. Thanks for watching, and be sure to join us again next week. May God richly bless you.